Welcome back to another episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the church until today. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and if this is your first time listening to us or you've been a long-time listener, do us a favor and please click the like or subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. As always, I'm joined by Dr. Carlos Ayer, the T. Larson Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Welcome back to another episode, Carlos.
It's wonderful to be here with you, Alberto, as always.
Yes, it is. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about something that I've always been fascinated about, apparitions.
Yes, and it can be a very confusing subject. And the reason it can be confusing is not just the phenomenon itself. It has very, very jagged edges, let's put it that way. It creates a stir. It creates problems for those who see things. But there's a lot of terminology in play. And then there's the official terminology given by scholars and by the Catholic Church. And terminology is used by everyone. So it's very easy to get lost in this maze. So one of the things I'm hoping we can do today is to, at first just draw some distinctions and then move on.
Why don't we start with the definition of an apparition? Because I have a pretty good idea, but I want to be sure I understand what an apparition is, and our listeners, they have a good idea what we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, the term apparition, as defined by experts, which include scholars and churchmen. The term apparitions applies to people having visions of individuals who are in heaven. So anyone who's in heaven can appear and be seen. And here's where the fine distinctions come in. Sometimes it's just the one person. Actually, quite often it's just the one person. But in many other occasions, it's been to several people at once. And in some occasions, it's been to hundreds, thousands. And later, we can cover this one apparition, which is one of the most astounding, where the Virgin Mary was seen by over 1 million people. So someone from heaven appears, and people living on earth see them. That's an apparition. And there are various different kinds of apparitions, right? Some have messages, some have no messages, some have predictions about the future, and so on. But we can get to that as we move on. The distinction that I think is important to have in mind is that a vision is when you see something, right? And technically, there are distinctions made between visions that occur during mystical ecstasies to the people we call mystics. Like St. Teresa, St. Bernard of Clairvaux. They saw things. They saw heavenly beings, but as part of their mystical ecstasies. The apparitions we're going to be talking about today are not part of mystical ecstasies, and they're not reserved for very holy people. As a matter of fact, most apparitions that I know of occur to people who are not expecting it at all. And as usual, and we'll get to this topic soon enough, it's one thing to have someone claim, "Oh, I saw the Archangel Michael," and for that claim to be accepted as true. And, things have changed tremendously over the last 2 millennia in the Christian religion when it comes to vision claims. Things are very different now than they were even just a century ago. So it's a big subject, though. Very, very big subject. And there are many, so many apparitions, in fact, that I have yet to see any list that claims to be complete. And they have been occurring since the earliest centuries of the church. Might recall that one entire book in the New Testament, book of Revelation, St. John having visions, and you read about the apostles having visions. You read about Mary and one legend appearing to the apostle James in present-day Spain near Saragossa in the year 40. But that's not an apparition. Those are visions by holy people. But there are accounts of heavenly beings, angels, saints, the Virgin Mary, Jesus, suddenly appearing to people who don't expect it at all. And these go back in time to the very earliest days of the church. But of course, because there's not much of a written record for the first 1,000 years or so, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire, during the early Middle Ages and through the Middle Ages, for heaven's sakes, you can map it. Sometimes you can map apparitions literally, geographically, by looking on the map at shrines that have been built at the same exact place where someone had an apparition. So in that respect, the closer you get to our time, the easier it is to quantify the number of visions. But again, I want to stress, as I said, that they have jagged edges, these apparitions. And not every apparition that is claimed ends up being approved. So we can get to that as we go along.
I think it's important you brought up the difference between visions and apparitions and how visions typically are experienced by holy people, by saints, by mystics. And apparitions are usually experienced by the common man, just regular people going through it, experiencing it. But I would say that when you look back at stories of apparitions, there's so many of them. Lords, for instance, in France, they carry a different type of weight to them for people, because when you have a mystic that says, I had a vision of the Virgin Mary, or I had a vision of Jesus, and people kind of will look at it that aren't believers or kind of think it could be made up, will say, well, this is a person that claims to be a mystic, and of course they're going to say that stuff. But when you have people that are not religious per se and are not part of religion, is not something that they are espousing, and say they had a vision, they saw something incredible, or several people, it kind of hits the public a little differently. Would you say that?
Oh, of course it does, yes. And as happens with people who claim that they're receiving special messages from these apparitions, the trouble caused by all these claims can be immense for the church as well as for the people who hear about it, because there's always this element of instability in the claim. And, some people of deep faith might be very troubled to hear about some person nearby who's claiming that she gets visits from the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary's giving out all these prophecies. They can be very disturbing. So, as is the case with all religious phenomena, right? It's a double-edged sword. For all the wonderful things that can happen, there's also trouble. But the point you make is very important, and that's why I went on this little side road, right? It's because the higher the number of people who claim to have seen an apparition, the more shaken people get. And we can get to one very specific one to begin with, right? And we're not going to take this in chronological order, but many of our listeners might be aware of this apparition. The apparitions that have been taking place in Medjugorje, in Bosnia, former Yugoslavia. They have been happening since 1981. And at first it was the children. And of course, those children are now grown up. And some of these visionaries from Medjugorje claim that they still see the apparitions. But Medjugorje attracted thousands and thousands and thousands of pilgrims since 1981. And people who have gone there have claimed that they have seen the Virgin Mary. Or other miracles take place, strange miracles. The rosaries are transformed from, very plain and simple to glowing objects. Or I've seen this. Somebody came back from Medjugorje, shared a photo with me, said they were just taking a photo of the location. But in the photo, what came out looked like, the silhouette of the Virgin Mary. And they think that photo is itself an apparition. So you've got thousands of people at Medjugorje claiming they see things. This stirs things up. And there are believers, obviously the people who flock there. There are the curious who just want to see for themselves. And then there are those who experience miracles. And there are the doubters who go there. And the doubters can go away either being not transformed, returning home the same way they were as when they left home. And you can have people whose lives are changed by the event. And it's still a controversial subject, Medjugorje. There are arguments on all sides for the, veracity of the claims being made. But I should also add, we're dealing with the Catholic Church and Catholic apparitions. And the Catholic Church has a very specific teaching on apparitions, which is even after the Catholic Church declares some apparition valid and true, Catholics are not obligated to believe that they're true. So it's another one of these fine Catholic distinctions. Oh, yes, this is true. But, if you have doubts about it, it's not a sin to have doubts about it.
So let's get into some of these apparitions.
Yeah.
Tell us about them.
Yeah, well, as I said before, the first millennium, the record's a bit sketchy. And there is one which actually involves the Pope and people who were with the Pope at the time. And here are the circumstances. All right, in the year 590, a very severe plague hit Rome. So severe, so many people were dying that the Pope died. So a new Pope was elected in 590, Pope Gregory, the very first monk to be elected Pope, known as Gregory the Great for many reasons. We've probably spoken about him more than once or twice. But anyway, this plague was ravaging Rome, so he did what people did when there was a plague. They processed. A procession went out to the streets of Rome, making its way through the streets of Rome, singing, praying, and as they crossed the Tiber River, the heavens opened, and St. Michael the Archangel was seen, along with numerous other angels, descending above the crowd. So we're talking, it's not just Gregory who's seeing this, it's the entire crowd that is seeing this and hearing heavenly music, smelling heavenly perfume. And the angels began singing the hymn, the Regina Caeli, Queen of Heaven, to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And then people saw the Virgin Mary seated on a throne above Michael and the angels. And then, as they were seeing all this, final vision that people saw was St. Michael the Archangel sheathing his sword. And I'm sure many of our listeners have seen these images of Archangel Michael carrying a sword. And that's the iconography for St. Michael the Archangel, who is always fighting the devil and will one day vanquish the devil. So that's why he's always in icons of Michael the Archangel. He is usually depicted stepping on the devil, often stepping on his neck. So anyway, anyone who has been to Rome or seen photos of Rome will know that near the Vatican, there's an ancient Roman castle, basically. It looks like a castle. But it was the mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian, which had been turned into a church by 590. And that's where people saw this vision of Michael sheathing his sword. And it's now known as the Castel San Angelo, or the Castle of saint angels. And what is this sheathing the sword thing in the vision? It's a belief that people had that plagues were a punishment from God. Very, very common belief at this time and throughout the Middle Ages and even into early modern period. So the procession had convinced God to end the plague. But everyone saw this, and that was quite spectacular. And then there were other apparitions of St. Michael throughout the centuries, continually. And we can get back to St. Michael because he's appeared in some 20th century apparitions. So anyway, as I said before, and I don't want to repeat this again in great detail, there are thousands of accounts, the first 15 centuries of Christian history. And many of these gained local approval. So during these first 15 centuries, there was no fixed system for the entire church to declare whether an apparition was true or not. And it was usually at a local level that it was accepted. And quite often in the early Middle Ages, these apparitions were accepted by popular acclamation. Although, of course, the bishop always had to approve it, ultimately. But communication was poor. Let's say you're traveling from one city to another, 100 miles apart. Along the way, you might encounter shrines that were set up to remember an apparition that you had never heard of. So, as communication improves, and especially after printing is invented, movable type printing, well, things change. In the 16th century, right after the Protestant Reformation took off, the Catholic Church changed many things. A kind of, as they say, the expression to tie loose ends. Well, the Catholic Church went on a campaign to tie all loose ends, and one of these loose ends was the process by which apparitions were judged. And it still remained at the local level that the process began. Always local, always the local bishop. But then the investigation becomes much more thorough, and certain criteria begin to be applied to discern whether an apparition was valid or not. And here's where things get interesting. The approval process. In order to be approved by a bishop, and these are the rules established after the Council of Trent, 16th century, there were guidelines. There couldn't be any factual errors in what had been reported or requested during an apparition by the person who appeared. So for the sake of simplicity, let's just say we're talking about apparitions of the Virgin Mary, which were the most common. So there couldn't be any factual errors in what Mary said, or there couldn't be anything very strange about any request made by Mary. And then the person who saw the apparition had to be deemed to be in good psychological health, balanced, honest, sincere, and respectful of church authority. That ruled out a lot of people. And there couldn't be anything about the apparition that went against church doctrine. And the person claiming to have seen the apparition couldn't be trying to benefit financially from the visions. And these guidelines are all still in place. And plus, one more, the apparition had to produce healthy spiritual experiences, perhaps even changes in people's lives. So let me go over one set of examples of how this change took place. And there's a wonderful book. I assign it to many of my classes, and students have been reading it in my classes since the book appeared in the early 1980s. The book is by William Christian Jr., who actually has several books on apparitions. And the title is Apparitions in Late Medieval and Renaissance Spain. It tells the fascinating story of how in Spain, and Spain is unique in this respect, Spain has an Inquisition, and everybody knows about the Inquisition. No one expects the Inquisition, as Monty Python said, but yes, in Spain, everybody expected the Inquisition. All apparition claims in the 16th century have to go through the Inquisition's seal of approval. So, throughout the Middle Ages in Spain, again, thousands of cases of simple people, many of them peasants, who claimed to have seen usually the Virgin Mary, sometimes an angel, sometimes some other saint. But the story goes like this. People start being quizzed by the Inquisition about the details of their apparition they had seen. And I return to one point I made before, that quite often shrines were built on the spot where apparitions had taken place. The Inquisition now wants to control the establishment of shrines because now it has the power to investigate whether the apparition is real or not. As people are brought in and questioned by the Inquisition, many apparition claims are discarded by the Inquisition and by the Church. My favorite example from the many examples in this book is the case of a peasant who claimed that the Virgin Mary had appeared and asked for a shrine to be built at the spot where this had taken place. So they start asking, well, what did the Virgin Mary look like? What did she sound like? What did she say? What was she wearing? And it gets down to the smallest details. One question derails the whole claim. They asked this peasant, what was Mary wearing on her feet? And the peasant said, gold sandals. Of course. That was it. You know, if this had been a game show on American television, the buzzer would have rung. Sorry, wrong answer. No, Mary can't be wearing gold sandals. A genuine Marian apparition? At this time, Mary doesn't wear luxurious footgear. No way. And not only that, the iconography of the Virgin Mary is such that she's not represented ever with gold sandals on her feet. As a matter of fact, in most icons of Mary or images of Mary where her whole body is depicted, she's barefoot. So what happens is that as more and more apparitions are rejected as false, the number of apparition claims begins to shrink. And by the late 16th century, apparitions claimed by peasants have shrunk enormously. And this happens not only in Spain, where the Inquisition is very efficient, but it happens in all other Catholic lands, kingdoms, duchies, whatever, cities even. People are afraid to claim apparitions. So the number of apparitions begins to shrink. Very interesting. You know, it's quantifiable. And this goes on for another 2 centuries or so. But then something very interesting happens. As rationalism, skepticism, even atheism begins to gain ground in the 19th century, well, beginning in the 18th century, but really it's the 19th century, that the number of apparition claims suddenly begins to, literally in some cases, you could say, you know, this explodes. There's an explosion of apparitions, especially apparitions of the Virgin Mary throughout Europe, throughout Latin America. And as a matter of fact, Latin America, every single Latin American country has at least one certified apparition of the Virgin Mary, usually more than one. And the best known of these occurred just about the same time that the Inquisition was clamping down on apparition claims in Spain itself. And this is perhaps the best known of all apparitions in Latin America, is Our Lady of Guadalupe. Mary appears to a native peasant. He's not Spanish. He's native. Juan Diego, the Spanish name given to him. Mary appears dressed in the same kind of clothing that native women would wear. She's dark-skinned, and her clothing also has many, many symbols that signify connections, not just to heaven, but to features and symbols that the natives would understand as basically a transition into or fulfillment of things they had always believed. And the most amazing dimension of this apparition, as probably most of our listeners know, is that Juan Diego took off this cloak, a native cloak, I forget, tilpe, I think it's called. The Virgin Mary asked him to fill it up with roses that were blooming at a time of the year when roses usually don't bloom. So he filled it with roses, and following Mary's instructions, he took it back to clerics of the church, as he was supposed to do. And when he unfurled this cloak, the image of Mary had been imprinted on it. And this is perhaps not only the best known, but one of the most amazing of these icons that are fairly common in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Christian Church. Icons not made by human hands, right? These are images. Usually they accompany an apparition, but not always. Sometimes they're just found. And it took several centuries, but Juan Diego was canonized. He's now Saint Juan Diego. And I always like to think of the contrast between Juan Diego's apparition of the Virgin Mary and that poor Spanish peasant who saw the wrong footwear on the apparition of the Virgin Mary. Because if the Virgin Mary had appeared under that native garb in Spain, obviously the Inquisition would have rejected the vision and said, no, Mary would never wear any such thing. So that goes to show you how Catholicism becomes global at the very same time that apparitions begin to shrink. So, 19th century. There are far too many apparitions of Mary in the 19th century to mention them all. So let's go through a few. And these apparitions have a very, very constant characteristic. Apparitions occur to children, beginning with La Salette in France in 1846. I'm only mentioning the best known. La Salette, France, 1846, children see the Virgin Mary. This was deemed legitimate by the Catholic Church, and from there on in, La Salette there's a shrine, and it becomes a pilgrimage center. The most famous of all, Lourdes in France, 1858. Virgin Mary appears to Bernadette Soubirous, a peasant girl. And many people know this story. At first the church authorities don't want to believe her. And the Virgin Mary tells her, among other things, to start digging on the spot right there. And a spring bubbles up. And the water from that spring begins to cure people with all sorts of ailments. Eventually, of course, Bernadette is believed. She is now Saint Bernadette, ends up being canonized. And quite often, these visionary children have a horrible time trying to get these clerical adults to believe them. And if anybody's interested in the Lourdes miracle, I think the film won Oscar for Best Film, Song of Bernadette, made in the 1940s, I think it was, which I remember watching as a child and thinking, oh my God, please, God, don't ever appear to me. I don't want to go through what Bernadette had to go through. And it's a common theme. And then there are others that become not only a religious phenomenon, but a political phenomenon. In Marpingen, in Germany, in 1876. Again, children. It's an apparition of the Virgin Mary. But at this time is when Germany is being unified. And of course, the unification is being carried out from Prussia by Protestants. And there's a great push to discriminate against all things Catholic. So the Virgin who appears at Marpingen becomes a symbol of Catholic identity at a time when Germany is being unified and Catholics they're not being persecuted in the sense that they're being thrown into prison or martyred, but the state is making every effort it can to overshadow the Catholic presence in Germany by the Protestant presence. And that's not the only one that happens in 19th century Germany. That's not the only one. There are so many others that actually experts, and one expert in particular, discovered that the peak period for the establishment of Marian shrines in Germany was the 19th century. You would think that, throughout the entire medieval period, the numbers would be greater. But no, there are so many Marian apparitions in 19th century Germany that they outnumber the medieval ones, at least for chapels that are established. Oh, and you look at the map, speaking of maps, Knock, Ireland, 1879. And then perhaps the second best known Marian apparition of the modern period, now it takes us to the 20th century. Fatima, Portugal, 1917. Again, children. And the children are not believed, and the children go through an immensely difficult time. And Fatima is perhaps best known because the Virgin Mary made 3 predictions to these children and also gave them instructions asking, for people to pray the rosary. 2 of the predictions were revealed. The third was not revealed until the pontificate of John Paul II. And it turned out to be in the 1950s and 60s as I was growing up. Oh, there were all these Catholic rumors that the third prediction was about the end of the world. But it turned out not to be that. And some think that the third prediction, again, we have to sift legend from fact, right? The Catholics who believed that the third prediction was the assassination attempt on John Paul II. And one of those children seers from Fatima actually lived for a long time, became a nun. And Fatima is one of the largest pilgrimage centers in the Catholic world. And if I could backtrack just a little bit, miracles occur at Fatima from the beginning. Talk about apparitions seen by thousands. At Fatima, there's the so-called miracle of the sun, where on a specific day, Mary had told the children, get people here, assemble people here, and people heard of this and came, and there were thousands of people gathered at Fatima. And it was raining, it was pouring rain. And suddenly the rain stopped, and these thousands of people who had gathered there saw the sun, quote unquote, dancing in the sky, right? They saw some visual apparition of a bright light that moved around in the heavens and interpreted it as the sun dancing. But once again, here we have a huge crowd of people seeing something that's totally anomalous, out of the ordinary, miraculous. And there continue to be miracles at Fatima as at Lourdes. People go to Lourdes by the thousands seeking healing. And as is the case with all miracle claims in the Catholic Church, they're investigated very thoroughly. Back to Spain, between 1961 and 1965, there were apparitions to children. And in these apparitions, the Archangel Michael was also involved. And that was thoroughly investigated as well. And it's still a very well-visited place. But it overshadowed by others like Fatima and Lourdes. And then there's Medjugorje, which we've already spoken about, still drawing pilgrims. But there are two very obscure or not very well-known apparitions that took place in the late 20th century and not many people know about. And they took place at unlikely locations. And I'd like to briefly bring these to our listeners' attention. First, actually chronologically, let me begin with the one that is later, 1973. Virgin Mary appears to a Japanese nun in Akita in northern Japan. And there are predictions, and there are messages, and of course, great controversy. Eventually, it was approved by the Catholic Church. Akita in northern Japan is a very remote location where there are barely any Catholics. And somehow there was this Catholic convent there. And the nun to whom the Virgin Mary appeared also had to undergo a very difficult time being investigated. But by far the most amazing, to my mind, the most amazing and unlikely apparition in recent times took place in a suburb of Cairo, Egypt, between 1968 and 1971. Now, I just revealed to our audience how old I am. Obviously, I was alive in 1973, and I was also alive in 1968 to 71. But I never heard of these apparitions. Akita I didn't hear of until my son went to teach in Japan for 2 years, and he was assigned to Akita. And that's how I found out about it. The one in Cairo, the suburb is Zaytun, which means olive. Zaytun in Arabic. 1968 to 71. This is the apparition I was referring to that over 1 million people claim to have seen. And here comes the most remarkable fact. Most of those million eyewitnesses are Muslim. Now, granted, in Islam, Mary is revered. She's not believed to be the mother of the Savior, not by any stretch, but she appears in the Quran, and there's kind of a reverence for Mary as a very special person. But this apparition took place outdoors, on the dome of a Coptic church, where Mary would appear every night as a bright light, but it was obviously, by all descriptions and photographs taken, basically a silhouette, a glowing silhouette. And everyone who flocked to this place was convinced it was the Virgin Mary. And as a matter of fact, the number of people flocking to this was so huge that actually buildings were demolished to make space for the people who gathered around this church to see this phenomenon. And this was reported, of course, as one would expect, in Egyptian newspapers, but barely made any appearance in Western newspapers, or even in Catholic literature. So this has gone under the radar, so to speak, even though it's perhaps, in terms of quantifying, the most amazing figure, number of people, and also the most amazing profile of those who saw the apparition. Because we're not talking about Catholics, we're talking about Muslims. So, as I said, apparitions have jagged edges.
It's funny you should mention that, because the apparition that you mentioned in Zaytun, I learned about that maybe a year ago, just by random chance, came across it. And when you think of the multitudes that saw it, it's amazing that this was not news all across the world, that I didn't grow up hearing about this. Right. And the same goes for the dancing sun. I learned about that a few months ago. And
really? Huh.
I had never heard of that happening. And again, that was another case where thousands of people saw it and experienced it. And I remember seeing a short documentary on it with newspaper clippings, of course, all in Portugal, but for so many people to experience something like that and it just completely ignored by the general public is really quite a thing, which I don't think speaks so much to its credibility that the media or whoever it would be didn't believe it was credible, but perhaps that it was so credible that they didn't really want it to get out.
It's weird, isn't it? Very weird. Medjugorje, on the other hand, even more recent, from 1981 on, that was in the news constantly, even the secular news, right, in the West. But I thought something very weird happened when war broke out in Bosnia, the horrible war that of the 1990s with, ethnic cleansing and all kinds of horrors. Medjugorje disappeared from view in the secular press. I know that in Catholic publications there was still plenty of news about Medjugorje, but the war was taking place there, and no connection made to it in the secular press. But again, the jagged edge, there is perhaps as much incredulity as there is credulity, and there is resistance even from church authorities. And I have an anecdote that refers to the way in which these claims are either accepted or not accepted. And it's somewhat funny because I approached a Dominican priest who was a great friend of mine, one of the best friends I've ever had. I said, tell me about this. What do you think is going on? And then something very typically Catholic, and Catholics will understand. Non-Catholics may not. There's a lot of rivalry between religious orders. And my friend said, it's a cheap Franciscan trick. Because the shrine at Medjugorje happened to, be in the hands of Franciscan friars. So you're not required to believe in these things if you're a Catholic. They're there for the taking or for the leaving, right? I got very interested in the Zaytun apparitions. I only heard about it probably about the same time you did. And I bought this book on Zaytun that appeared very, very recently. And unfortunately, it's not very well written. It's difficult to read. And, as a historian, I had trouble with the fact that the person who wrote the book didn't speak Arabic, couldn't read Arabic. So I had to rely exclusively on English language publications. But there is one good aspect to this book, is that the author takes on all of the quote-unquote scientific explanations that have been given for this phenomenon, try to debunk it. And he debunks the debunkers.
I wanted to ask you, we've been discussing apparitions, actual heavenly beings appearing to humans. What about depictions that have appeared? For instance, going back to Our Lady of Guadalupe, the depiction of her on Juan Diego's cloak. Because growing up, I remember seeing, one that I always remember, it was a window on a building that had this, what looked like the silhouette of the Virgin Mary. And in a more comical way, a guy who toasted a piece of bread, and when he pulled it out of the toaster, there was the face of Jesus on it. Do those fall into the apparition as well?
Well, yes, they do. But once again, verifying, whatever the church is that might want to verify or deny the legitimacy of this, they could use different standards for it. Many of these somewhat humorous stories about Jesus appearing on toast or the side of a refrigerator and so on, oddly enough, they come from Protestants. It's usually Jesus, right? An image of Jesus. So they're not going to be revered as holy objects because, we didn't even get into this subject, but of course Protestants rejected all of this. Apparitions, no, they just don't happen in Protestant Christianity. I should say there are exceptions. These Jesus on toast, Jesus on a refrigerator kind of apparitions occur among Protestants. Hard to say what people do with them in that Christian tradition, whatever it is that it is. However, within Catholicism, what happened throughout the Middle Ages is that these would be revered, any such image that appeared. And even to this day, they would be revered, but no official shrine would be set up for anything like that after the 16th century. And actually, now that you brought up the subject, I remember that not very long ago in Chicago, under a viaduct, water had been seeping for decades. And there was a silhouette that reminded everyone of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So, Chicago has an immense Mexican population. As you can imagine, it became a popular shrine. And then suddenly, one night, somebody completely defaced it, basically killing the image. And there went that shrine. And I should say, there went the shrine. Well, there went the story. I never read anything else about it in the news media. Chances are that perhaps people would still go there because the image had been there, right? They fall under the spectrum of apparitions, yes. I remember as a child, come to think of it, you've opened a door in my memory vault. In Havana, my father took us to see a bathtub, a very old bathtub, where, again, there was some kind of leaking plumbing, had left the silhouette of the Virgin Mary right under the faucet. Yes, it was a silhouette, looked just like the Virgin Mary. Especially the one Cuban apparition that is the best known, Our Lady of Charity. It had that silhouette. And I remember being kind of puzzled by it. But also at the very same time, I was very young. I was very scared by it. So yeah, those things fall under the same umbrella, but they are different. They're not an apparition.
Well, it seems that the vast majority of these apparitions are of the Virgin Mary, which would make it extremely Catholic and Orthodox. What would you say in your studies of what you've read and what you've seen, what percentage of apparitions that have been verified by the church are of the Virgin Mary as opposed to St. Michael or Jesus?
I don't know if anybody has done the number crunching, or even if the number crunching is possible, but it's undeniable. Most apparitions, especially after the Council of Trent, most apparitions are Marian apparitions. It's the Virgin Mary, undoubtedly.
And you think the Council of Trent had anything to do with that?
Well, I think Protestantism might have had something to do with it for sure, because Mary is not revered as the Mother of God. Mary is not revered as a virgin either in Protestantism. I mean, she's special because she's in the New Testament and she's Jesus' mother. But Protestants do not venerate the Virgin Mary and do not consider her a mediator, or mediatrix is the more appropriate term. They don't consider her a mediatrix between humans and her Son. So, as a historian, is it possible that the church emphasized approval of Marian apparitions because Protestants were denying Mary her special status? Yes, it's quite possible. As a matter of fact, that was the case in Marpingen, in all these Marian shrines in Germany in the 19th century. I've read books and articles that view it as a Catholic response to what, the German word is Kulturkampf, or the cultural struggle that took place when Germany was unified and the Protestant majority, made life uncomfortable for Catholics in many ways.
And I remember reading somewhere that Christianity really exploded in Latin America after that apparition of Mary. The population finally had something they could relate to.
That's correct, yes. And there are various interpretations of this, why it is so, trying to explain, what made her so appealing? Yes, but there's no getting around the fact that, what a wondrous sign, right? That Aztecs, all the other natives who were not Aztec, who became subjects of the Spanish Empire and were being Christianized, they now had someone to pray to for intercession who was one of them. There's very interesting literature on the image itself, very much the same kind of literature that you find about the Shroud of Turin. How did this image get there? Could it have been something painted? Well, there are problems, scientifically and technically, trying to prove whether it was painted or not. I went to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in 1972 and was being given a tour of the shrine along with, dozens of others. And I remember this from the tour guide, said that the image had been scientifically analyzed. And the most surprising thing that was found was that you can see Juan Diego. If you look at it, with a large enough magnifying lens, you can see the image of Juan Diego reflected in Mary's eyes. And tour guide went on to say, no human could ever paint that.
This is a topic that has always fascinated me, so I'm glad we got to do this episode and learn more about it. As we reach the end of our time, what do you have for us for the next episode?
Well, I think since there is confusion about the terminology, visions, apparitions, and there's this distinction made between visions that occur as part of mystical ecstasy versus visions that are outside of mystical ecstasy that might be seen by very ordinary people, even totally illiterate, uneducated people, who, as in the case of Juan Diego, really didn't have much of a clue as to what the Christian religion was all about. Let's delve into mystical visions, which are also very fascinating.
Indeed. Well, Carlos, thank you for another wonderful episode. And thanks to all our listeners for your support. Keep the emails coming. We do appreciate hearing from you. And until the next time, thank you for listening to the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eyre, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.